Welcome to the Strathroy and District Historical Society's online presentation of a virtual tour of Fanshawe Pioneer Village with guest speaker Morgan Shropshire, the Education Coordinator at Fanshawe Pioneer Village in London, Ontario. This presentation took place on May 15th, 2021 via Zoom. For more information, please visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Strathroy Historical Society or visit our website at sdhsociety.weebly.com.
So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Morgan is the Education Coordinator at Fanshawe Pioneer Village in London. She has a Bachelor of Fine Arts honor specialization in studio, and she has a minor in history from Western University. She also has a Bachelor of Education degree from Nipissing University. Morgan has always been drawn to alternative forms of education, and she's had the opportunity to work in galleries and with community groups. And 2021 will be her 8th season with Fanshawe Pioneer Village. And as Education Coordinator, Morgan creates, promotes, and teaches a variety of lessons to students of all ages through visits to the museum and more recently through the new digital education programs. So we're kind of her guinea pigs almost. We're going to see how well this amazing virtual tour that she's planned for us is going to go. And I have muted everybody so that everybody should be able to hear Morgan. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type it in the chat. Allison, who's also working with Morgan from Fanshawe Pioneer Village, she is going to be on duty monitoring the chat, and she will answer any questions that you have as we go along. Morgan might be able to answer some questions at the end as well. So without further ado, Morgan, I'm going to let you take it away.
Perfect. So good evening, everyone. As it was said, I'm really lucky tonight. I have my colleague, Allison Klegus, joining us. She is our public programming coordinator. She wears many hats at the museum. But what I'm going to be doing tonight is I'm going to be taking you just on kind of a miniature tour of Fanshawe Pioneer Village of the museum. You are a bit of a guinea pig, it's true. We've been doing I have been doing digital education programs at home, but this is our first digital program in the museum itself. We were lucky enough to get Wi-Fi extenders put into the museum. So we'll be seeing how well our Wi-Fi works out. I tested it a few times now, it seems to be good. And I also have a little new technology that I'm using. I'm holding my phone, so hopefully everything works out well. Like it was said, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. Allison, if there's anything along the way that you want to tell me, you can. Yeah, we're going to get started. So I'm just going to try and flip my screen around here. All right. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be taking you for a walk through the museum. Fanshawe Pioneer Village, for those who have never visited the museum, we cover 100 years of history. So we start in the year 1820 and we go to the year 1920. And we focus on the kind of growth and change of London and Middlesex County during that time. Now, of course, in 1820, we don't have the City of London yet, but we talk about kind of the slow change of rural communities, especially, but how villages appeared, the experience of settlers, of newcomers. And then a big thing that the museum's doing right now is trying to also talk about the fact that it's not just one story, there's many stories to be told. They're all interwoven and connect with each other at different points. The stories of settlers and newcomers and colonization have clearly had a massive effect on not just the land, but on the people who are living here, the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So there's a lot of things the museum does talk about. So to start off with, because we do start in 1820 with our interpretation, I do want to recognize that there is a long history before 1820. Of course, we have many, many, many Indigenous peoples who have used this land, been its stewards, called it home, traded, hunted, all these things on this land. So it's really important that we recognize that. And so the first area that we come to here in the village that you can kind of see is what we call our Carolinian woodland. And the Carolinian woodland has been a project that we've been doing for quite a few years now, of pulling out invasive species of trees and plants and shrubs and trying to actually plant native species to kind of reestablish what it would have looked like before the footprint of settlement arrived here. So all these little tiny trees and shrubs that you see, these are the start of our regrowth of a Carolinian woodland, a very small section. But this is an area that we're hoping to use to talk more about those days of treaty making, the days of first contact, which we don't talk a lot about because by 1820, so much history had already happened here in Canada. But this is a starting point for us to bring up stories throughout the 100 years that clearly are really important. And so I do want to recognize that this land is the traditional home of the Chinootan, who we usually call the Adewandran, the Wendat peoples, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenape peoples. These are all groups who not only was it their homes, but for many it is their home still. It's their traditional lands. We do have 3 sovereign Indigenous nations who are still located in our region today that we also must recognize. These groups were all here before the founding of Canada, before Confederation. We have, of course, the English names for them. They have their own names, but the English names for them are the Chippewa, the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. These are all right in our area. And so we're hoping that with this area here, with our woodland, that we can start to bring in some of those stories. This is a process that the museum is always recognizing that we need to continue to grow, continue to change, and to better serve our community. So it's a big thing that we're looking at right now. But the museum itself is actually set up in kind of 4 sections. So we do have kind of a timeline where we move through these 4 sections and we see how things change and develop over that 100 years. So our first section of the village, and I'll be walking you through and I'll be showing you the outside of some of these buildings. But the first section that we're in represents Fanshawe settlement is what we call it. And so it represents 1820 to 1850. During this section, we have, we focus on the arrival of different groups coming to the area, but we tend to focus on settlement groups and what their experience was like. By 1820, we had many different groups of people living here, not just the Indigenous peoples. We had, of course, the arrival of different Europeans. We also had loyalists who had arrived here from the United States. So we had, after the American Revolution, groups of United Empire loyalists arriving, and they had started to arrive more in the late 1700s. And then during that time, though, we also have a few Black loyalists who are arriving as well. Black loyalists are a group that some of them have been freed during the American Revolution already, but many of them were enslaved, and they did work with the British government and supported them in hopes of gaining their freedom. And so many of the Black loyalists do end up going to the East Coast, which is where many loyalists settled, but we do have a few in this area of Ontario. The settlement group, though, that we focus on here is the Richard Talbot Settlement Group. And they came in 1818 from Tipperary, Ireland. And so when they arrived here, this area, much of this area, was that forest, that huge forest where London gets its nickname from. And when they got here, they were getting plots of land. They're around 200 acres is what they were given. And they had to do settlement duties to actually own it, to get the deed. So they are having to do things like clear the land, make themselves a house. They had to fence their property. And they also were charged with the responsibility of clearing trees along the edge of their property to help make a road. So all these different settlement duties took quite a bit of work. It could take you anywhere from 5 to 7 years to complete all these things and finally get the actual deed for your hard work. And so that's what this section of the village really focuses on. I apologize if during our tour you see a few random things. We are in the process of opening. You might see the big bright blue tarp in the background. Along the way, I will tell you a bit about a few of our buildings. Normally, our walking tours are about 2 hours long, so we have kind of a quicker version today. The first building in our museum, though, is the LG log house here. And the LG log house that belonged to the LG family, it was built around 1867, and it came from West Missouri Township. And so the LG family, it was donated to the museum by Michael LG, but it was his father, James, who actually purchased the house in the 1870s. So while the house is kind of past that early settlement, many, many log homes look like this. Simple one-room houses. And you did have to build a house at least this size and live in it. That was another really important thing, is actually living in the home. Also in our first cluster here, we call the different sections clusters. In our first cluster, we have our oldest building at the village, and that's the Colbert Log Barn, which you can see here. The log barn is something that families would have to work towards. Every year you're cutting down more and more trees, trying to expand your farm, trying to get established, and having outbuildings like barns and ice houses and smokehouses were all an important part of that. Of course, with a barn like this, having neighbors nearby who could help you build it can make it much, much faster, much, much quicker. The Colbert Log Barn itself was built in the 1840s, and it also came from West Missouri Township. Yeah, flip around here. The other important part of settlement in those early days, of course, was education. People were coming to this region for many different reasons. Of course, the farmland here was one of the big things, the access to actual land. This area filled up very, very quickly because of the efforts of Colonel Thomas Talbot, so a different Talbot from Richard. But he was one of the big reasons the area filled up so quickly. But here we have in the village in this section our representation of a log school. So this schoolhouse here is not an original structure. It's actually a replica. And it's actually a replica that looks more similar to a building from Lower Canada, so from French Canada. And that has to do more with the way the logs are on the end, where they have the actual pieces sticking out. In Upper Canada, those would have been cut nice and smooth, as you have seen on the log house. And with education in those early days of the 1800s, a lot of things are happening. We have the establishment of the early days of a school board happening. schools are actually slowly starting to get a little bit of funding. And so what would happen in an early settlement is you would have basically the community members would come together, recognize the need for a school, and then they would build it themselves. So they would have to raise the money, build the school, and find the teacher. And in the very early days, the teacher was often just the smartest person in the community, the smartest person around. They weren't necessarily trained or educated to be a teacher. Part of the reason for that was that it was a little bit harder to convince a well-educated teacher or person to come out to the backwoods or come out to the edge of settlement, which in the 1820s, this area still was. There's still those early days of settlement. Now, the government, as it slowly started to help with the establishment of schools, they would give sometimes a grant to a school or help give some money towards establishing a school. But you had to show that you had 20 students who were willing to be part of the school. And that money was more to help with lowering tuition fees. So at this time, education is going to be costing you money. For a parent, for a family to send one of their children to school, they are going to have to pay tuition. They are going to have to pay for their child to come. And so in these early days of education, it was usually maybe just one child going to school. At this time, it's going to be usually just boys going to school. Girls were usually taught at home. It won't be until later on that education becomes mandatory for everyone. And in this schoolhouse here, you're learning very basic lessons, arithmetic, spelling, any of the things that you might need to do business later on. And so this very start of the village is very, very simple. Of course, there's not a lot here. And that just has to do with the fact that people are still getting started. Now, as we continue on through the village, we move into cluster 2, into our second section. And this section of the village represents 1850 to 1880. And it's supposed to represent basically the start of villages, the start of little hamlets, and how those first villages grew. Here, if you look ahead of us, you'll see we have 2 roads that kind of connect. This is our crossroads community. In those early days, of course, you don't have a lot of roads, a lot of well-established roads. Many of the first roads in the area, they would have followed traditional indigenous trails that have been well established and well used for years. For example, the Talbot Road, that followed an indigenous road. And so as you do get roads being built, where you had 2 that connected or intersected, you're going to have more travel there. You're going to have more people passing through this one spot. And so the very first businesses tended to pop up around crossroads. That's because it made sense for you to basically put your business where there's going to be people. And so that's what this section of the village represents. Those very first businesses or buildings you might see in the early village. One of those, of course, is one of the most important businesses in the village, and that's the blacksmith. So our blacksmith shop is a replica shop. It was one of the first buildings that we had here at the museum when we opened way back in 1959. It was built and designed by the conservation area, who actually were the ones who helped start the museum originally. And this shop here is supposed to be representative of an 1860s shop and a rural blacksmith. So very much filling the need of making things like horseshoes, farming implements, helping to make metal parts for carriages, the metal tires for wagon wheels. So they often either worked very closely with other people like carpenters, carriage makers, farriers, or in those early days, they might have done many of them jobs themselves too. The other building that you normally would see pop up first in an early village would be a building like a tavern or an inn. And that's what this building here is meant to represent at the museum. This building actually originally was not a tavern. We interpret it now as a tavern. It did originally belong to the Corbett family. It was donated by the Corbetts at a time when the museum was looking for a building to hopefully fill in that hole. So we didn't have a tavern or inn or anything here. And so the Corbetts had donated it because they did have a very large family, and they felt sometimes like their house was an inn because of people coming and going all the time. And so here at the museum, we interpret it as a very, very early tavern. We aren't going inside the buildings today because of just time and the fact that we're still setting some of them up for the season. But on the inside of this building, you actually can see that it was originally a log structure. So you can see the log walls inside. And it is a two-story building. Many early taverns were either 2 stories. Some eventually would become 3. And the fact that this one's wood shows you it's very early too. Many early taverns were also made of stone, if the stone was available. And so with a tavern in the early village, it was essential. Basically, it filled all kinds of community needs. Not only was it a place to rest and get food along your travels, it was a spot to catch the next stagecoach if you're trying to travel between places. It was a spot to get your mail. People didn't know where your house was out in the middle of the woods, but they knew where the tavern was. You could come here and pick up mail, pick up supplies. So it was a place full of people trading. Sometimes surveyors would work out of the tavern because it was that central spot. In many ways, it kind of acted as a community space. Town meetings were held here, sometimes even early church services. Even sometimes school could happen here if needed. It all just depended on the community. So every tavern in each community would be slightly different, but they really filled all the needs of a meeting space. Inside many taverns, you'd have a section for a bar, you'd have an eating area, and the rooms upstairs. And the bedrooms upstairs were often sometimes just one large common room. So you didn't get a lot of privacy in these early taverns. The way this building is set up is that one half of the building was for the family, and then the other half was for the guests. And that also is very common for those early taverns. Like many of these businesses, the families either lived in a back part or sometimes in the second floor. The tavern was actually the last building to have been physically brought to the museum. The other thing that was important about the taverns or the inns in those early days is that it was a place for just news and information. It was full of all the town gossip. So if you needed to know what was going on, this is where you're going to come. Now across the way, just here, we have 3 different buildings in this section. Sorry with my technology. 2 of the buildings are meeting halls. So we have Orange Lodge. This is the Purple Hill Loyal Orange Lodge. So if anyone knows where Purple Hill Road is, that is where it came from. And Orange Lodges were one of the many fraternal groups in the 1800s. This particular lodge was built in 1880, and like I said, came from Purple Hill in West Missouri Township. The first meeting of Purple Hill Lodge number 817 was held in 1857. It was actually originally held in a person's house before the lodge was actually built. Something interesting about this particular lodge was that eventually in the 1920s, they added a maple floor in, and that floor had the reputation of being the best dance floor in the whole area. So here at the museum today, we don't really, we don't host Orange Order meetings or anything in this building. It has now become more of our community space where we hold dances. We do a lot of dance program. We will do storytelling, things like that in here because it is a very just large open space inside. The interior of it doesn't have many of the imagery and artwork and different things that the Orange Lodges would have had. It is, though, a building that is full of a very, very complicated history, since the Orangemen were people who were loyal to Britain. They were extremely patriotic, and they believed that everyone should have that patriotism for the British Empire. They also believed everyone should be Protestant, hold the same values that they saw as proper. So that is one of the reasons why over time the group has slowly faded in membership. We do still have Orange Orders here in the London area, but not as many as there were in the 1800s. There was many, many, many Orangemen in the 1800s, and they were a group very much connected to the politics of the time. A lot of very wealthy members who had some political influence. I'll come back to talk about this building in a second, but I do want to also point out that we do also have the brick building you see here representing a Masonic lodge. And the Masonic lodge here, this building was originally actually the Pawn Mill School. But we now have it set up as a Masonic lodge. It is actually used still for Masons meetings, and we do have local Masons who come and interpret it. They are the ones who actually are responsible for having set up the inside as a meeting hall. And so it's a very, very interesting space. I don't have as many details about the Masons, just because just like the Orange Order, these were fraternal organizations. Only men could be in these groups. And as myself, as I am not a man, I don't know all the secrets of it. But they definitely were both of these groups. Many of these organizations in the early 1800s were helping with, they're helping settle newcomers. They're helping fundraise for new buildings. They're holding community socials, picnics. They were looking to give back to their community, whether it be if someone was sick or hurt, helping you out on your farm. That's what these organizations did. So they played a very, very important role for the growth of societies, the growth of communities. The other building that we have in this section here, one of our larger buildings, and this is Lochaber Church. This is actually a Presbyterian church. It's also from East Williams Township, and it was built in 1884. The interesting thing about this church here is that the congregation of this church actually decided to break away from the rest of the Presbyterian Church of Canada. And so they separated because they wanted to uphold the very strict beliefs of simple, focused faith. They want to be very focused on their prayers, their beliefs. Inside this building, this church here, it's very, very plain. There are not decorations or ornamentation. They wanted to make sure the congregants were focused on the sermons, which sometimes could be 2 or 3 hours long. And they were done both in English and Gaelic. We do have a few recordings of sermons done in this church in Gaelic still in our collection. Allison, who's the one who's joined us, has actually been working to try and get those digitized for us. And so, of course, churches and religion played such an important part in the early communities. Religion was fundamental in the growth of society in terms of what was the norm, what could you practice, what could you not do. With the early crossroad communities, though, well, we focus more on the settlement experience of people coming from England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales. We have to remember, too, there are people coming from other countries. And we also have people who are coming during this time period who are seeking freedom. So between 1850 and 1880, we have many, many groups of people arriving. When people came, they tended to settle near people who had either similar interests, similar religion, language, traditions, background, beliefs. And part of the reason for that was that there was that comfort in knowing that the people you live near were like you. But for some of those groups too, there was safety in being near people who had similar beliefs, depending on the reasons why you came to Canada. We have during this time, the height of the Underground Railway, a railroad is happening. So like I mentioned, many freedom seekers. And that's something that is important for our area, is that there was many, many freedom seekers coming to this spot. This is a spot on a terminus on the Underground Railroad, as well as before that, we had the Wilberforce settlement, which actually would have fallen under Cluster 1, but they also were a group of Black people who had come from Cincinnati, from Ohio, who were trying to find a place with less oppressive laws so they could build their homes. And so they were a group who decided to come and settle together because of financial reasons, but also because they knew it would be a lot easier to establish themselves together. The Wilberforce settlement didn't last as long as they hoped because of financial difficulties, as well as many other reasons. But many of the people in those communities decided to go to other Black settlements. So the building we see here is still also in our Cluster 2 section. This is Caver Hill House. It actually originally belonged to the Sturton family, and it was built in 1867. It's from Elgin County. And so again, 1867, of course, we know is the year of Confederation. So we have that happening during this period. So here in this section of the village, not only are we talking about development of communities, we're talking also about what's happening with the formation of the country of Canada. And we're also talking about just a lot of political change that's happening. What this section of the village back here represents is a second generation home. So we visited LG Log House at the very beginning. That's of course your first home. But once you lived here long enough, you will build a second house, a bigger, better house. And what this whole little section is here that I've been walking around showing you is supposed to represent the Caver Hill homestead. So this family has built their second home. They have also built their fields. So they have got their crops going. They have got their gardens going. These different fields around me are the sheep paddocks we have here at the museum. And this is our animal stable, which originally actually was a family's house. This originally was the log house of the Weeks family, but now we use it as our stable. And that's what many of the families would have done. They would have taken their log house, repurposed it for a stable or a granary as well. For many of the families who established themselves here, they would start to figure out different forms of income. So our next building in the village is actually our carpentry shop or woodworking shop. This also is supposed to be part of the Caverhill homestead here at the museum. And this wood shop here did belong to William Caverhill. The building still has a connection to the Caverhill family here at the museum because the grandson of William Caverhill, John Caverhill, actually still volunteers with us. And so this is supposed to be a way for the family to maybe make some money in the winter months, or as families started to have children who grew into adulthood, it'd be very common for you to maybe split up the homestead for more people to farm it, or some of those children to maybe go into specialities. So here with the Caverhills, two of the brothers decided to open the wood shop. And then one of the brothers, or a few of the brothers actually, decided to work on the family's orchard. And so that's what we'll be coming up to next, is the museum's apple orchard. Now, none of these trees would have come from the Caverhill apple orchard, but we do know that there are a few trees still on the original farm in Lobo, because again, we still have family members who help here with the museum. So this would have been part of that homestead. You'd have your gardens, your crops, your animals, your orchard, because by this time, the farmers were not just subsistence farming, trying to get enough food to just survive, but they're actually starting to grow various things so they could actually start to make a little bit of an income. At this time, it's most common to have mixed farming. And mixed farming just means that you have a mixture of animals, various crops, fruit. And that's because in the early 1800s, there is a bit of a depression and then some issues with growing wheat. And because if you only grew wheat and you had a bad crop season, your family would suffer. So the farmers here in Ontario started to grow various things so they had better luck. Oops. So we've actually come into our third cluster now. And this section of the village represents 1880 to 1910. We actually only have a few buildings in this section, but it's supposed to represent rural life. Through most of the 1800s, farming here in Middlesex County is the most common job. But you'll find when we get to the last section, there's a big shift that's happening. At the end of the 1800s, we have industrialization fully in effect here in Canada now. We have more people who've moved to the area, and just really a growth in all areas of living. The first building that we'll look at in this section is Fanshawe School. This is school section number 19. It came from Fanshawe and Highbury, so it's actually the building that came the shortest distance to the museum. This one-room schoolhouse here was built in 1871, and in 1871, they actually passed one of many school acts here in Canada or in Ontario. And the School Act in 1871 actually made school mandatory for both boys and girls. And so it's a very important year because now there's more people having the opportunity for education, but it's also now not the choice of your parents. It's actually decided that everyone needs to be having this. Now, the whole story of education in Upper Canada, Ontario, is a very, very complicated story. There is a lot to it, just the growth and change. Like I said, there's many different school acts. But also at this time, we have to remember the education opportunities were not the same for everyone, and the education experiences were not the same for everyone either. There is segregation in schools here in Canada. So Black students having to go to separate schools. And that's because of just the racism and prejudice that was here. Although many of the Black schools that were created here in Ontario were some of the best schools around. And there were at many of the Black schools, not just Black students, but many white students attended there too, just because the high level of instruction, but many of the schools didn't get the same funding. So it's a very complicated story. The other part we must recognize is that long before 1871 and long after, far too long, we also have residential schools here in Ontario, in Canada. So that is something that we can't forget either, that you are having students who are being taught not in their traditional way, Indigenous children being forcefully taken from their families, from their communities, and having their traditions and language and religion and beliefs erased. So a forced assimilation is happening during this time as well. Here at the museum, we do talk about that. We do talk, though, about the role of schools at this time for communities in Middlesex County. These schoolhouses were used as a way to turn you into a proper British citizen. Inside, we have our picture of Queen Victoria. We have a portrait of Sir John Macdonald. We have the British flag. We sing God Save the Queen, because those were the things happening at the time. But it was the way to kind of make all the students the same. And that's something that we talk about with our field trips that come today, is why schooling back then was the way it was and how it's so different from today. An interesting thing about the schoolhouse, the building itself, we can't see it. It's hard to see, but on the bricks, if you look closely, you can actually see the names carved of the students who attended the schoolhouse. So over time, they actually carved their names into the bricks. And SS-19 was used all the way to the 1950s. This other house that we have here in this section is, this is Jury House. This is, again, another farmhouse. And the Jury House is really important here to the museum because the family that it belonged to, the Jury family, their son, Wilfred, he actually was our first curator here at the museum. And so Wilfred Jury, this was his boyhood home. He grew up outside of Lobo. And the house is built in the 1880s. So it's built in 1888, actually as a wedding present for Wilfred's parents, Amos and Julia. So as we say, it's a pretty good wedding present. And the Jury family, they were very successful farmers. They did have a mixed farming operation. And unlike many other farmers at the time, they actually only had 2 children. So they had Wilfred and their daughter, Irene. Wilfred, when he grew up, he decided not to be a farmer. He actually decided to become an archaeologist. And he also actually dropped out of school. He thought he could learn more from the real world than what school could teach him. But interestingly enough, he does later on go and have connections with Western University. As I mentioned, he's our first curator, and he's also helped with the development of the Museum of Ontario Archaeology too. He helped get that museum started as well. And so the Jury farmstead is supposed to represent a farm at the end of the 1800s, at the turn of the century, because this part of the village goes from 1880 to 1910. And during this time, as I mentioned, you're having people start to leave the country, move into towns or urban spaces and the cities. And that has to do with better mechanization, better farm tools. As you have all those better tools, you need less people on the farm. And so the Jury family, they were very, very successful farmers. They did have a number of items such as a steam traction engine. They would rent that out for money or lend it to neighbors for a bit of money to help with the farm as well. So I know we're going a little bit quickly. There's a lot to see at the museum. As I said, normally our tours are much, much longer. But I just want to make sure you get a look at all the different buildings that we have. We are working really hard to try and get things ready so that we can open when it is safe to do so. And so hopefully you will have a chance to visit us. There's a few more buildings to see. I will walk through this section, but this last cluster of the village represents 1910 to 1920. And while it only really represents, oops, I think the battery just died for my tool. Hold on one second. There we go. All right. I was using a new piece of technology and its battery just died. This section of the village, while it only represents 10 years of history, it has the most buildings and so many stories to go along with it. Of course, between 1910 and 1920, London has definitely grown quite a bit. And so this section of the village is supposed to talk about that story about when London is slowly starting to become a city. So what it's like as all these rural towns are, well, replaced by the larger city, the larger urban centers, as there's more stores and things available. But also during this time, we have the story of World War I that we talk about. We talk about a lot of different social organizations, women's rights. So these are all things we talk about in this section of the village. The White House that we see off in the distance there, that house is our doctor's house. That's Dr. Jones' house. So we do also talk about the changes in medicine, in science and technology in this cluster. For some of you who visited the museum in the past, you might know this house as Miller House, which is what it used to be interpreted as. But about around 6 years ago is when we started to interpret it now as Dr. Jones' house, using the medical collection of his tools and his records that we have here in the museum's collection. The little purple building you see there, I say it's purple, is our weaving shed that belonged to Thomas Alder. It actually has a barn loom in it. But Thomas Alder, he is actually the grandfather of Wilfred Jury, which is how we came to get that building. I'll flip back over here again to the yellow house that people always love and know. That's Peel House. Peel House was the childhood home of Paul Peel, who's considered London's first, or Canada's first, internationally known artist or internationally acclaimed artist. So he did grow up here in London before eventually going to the States, to Philadelphia, and then to Paris, to France, and became a very accomplished painter. Unfortunately, Paul Peel passed away when he was 32 because of some form of lung disease, whether that be tuberculosis or something related. He likely passed away just because of the long hours he was working and the huge amount of paintings he was making and the very small space he was working in with very poor ventilation. And of course, paints, which at the time, they didn't know how toxic they were. This is the other church we have here at the museum. This is Trinity Anglican Church. So this church here is from Sebringville, so just outside Stratford. And this church came in 3 parts when it was brought to the museum. But it is an example of a Carpenter Gothic church. So it's actually one of only 3 Carpenter Gothic churches left in Ontario. So it does have a special designation. And with Trinity Church, the Carpenter Gothic style can be seen in the fact that it's made of wood, the tall vertical lines on the building, the arches they're incorporated into the design, as well as ornamentation. And so if you go inside this church, you will actually see that we have, or you'll see in the decoration, the number 3 repeated, the pattern of 3 repeated in carvings, in windows, in even the lights inside. So it's a very, very beautiful church that we still use for wedding ceremonies today. The last little part here of the village is what really shows off that town feeling, that urban feeling. So you'll see definitely over here how we're still setting things up. But by this time, by 1910, the 1900s, London had significantly grown. London was a very important space because of its location, the fact that it's kind of right between Toronto and Windsor. And so because of that, our industry definitely grows very quickly because of where we are with access to water, to the US, to the Great Lakes. We're kind of in a nice central space. As well as in the 1850s, the railway has come to the London region. And so it's very easy for us to be shipping things to different spots. We have a lot of industry that's developing. But as our industry grows, all these little crossroad communities, all these little urban towns, they have now, they need to change. All the little businesses that you would have had, the tradespeople and craftspeople, they are now having to figure out ways to kind of keep their business. In this section, behind all the picnic tables, is our harness shop. The harness shop is a good example of how that is someone who, by 1920, we have the automobile here. And so they aren't making as many saddles, as many harnesses. They're doing a lot more repair work. Many harness makers turn to actually repairing shoes, doing more cobbling work. The general store, so this is Denfield General Store from Denfield, one of the most recognized buildings here at the museum. It's another example of a building, of a business that's having to change with the ways. General stores are going from being the center of the community. Everyone needs to come here. This is where you get your supplies. This is where you get your food. To all of a sudden, well, now you could go to London and have a lot more choices. So to stay relevant, many general stores are installing things like telephones. The post office was usually found here. So Denfield did have the post office and the general store. And often general stores for some smaller communities acted as banks as well, especially in the early days of settlement. They often acted as the community banker. because they are one of the few places that could have money on hand. I'll just point out a few of our last buildings. We don't normally on our tour go into detail about all of them, but we have a replica of the early London Free Press. So we do have in the Free Press, our print shop, a number of presses. We talk a lot about the importance of newspapers, not just for getting information into the community, but the role it played in politics, the role it played in pushing for social change. So that's another thing, especially for women, for Black rights. A lot of newspapers played a lot of important roles in that. We also have a replica here of the Museum of the Early London Brewery. This replica building was built by Labatt during the Canadian Centennial in 1967. And it used to be in front of the Labatt Brewery downtown before it was donated and brought to the museum. The other little building, or not little building, definitely one of the biggest buildings, is our sawmill. It's a little bit hard to tell from looking at the outside, but the inside of that building is so interesting. The Harmer sawmill, it was used for many years here at the museum for demonstrations, for cutting logs, but sawmills are such an important part of the growth of communities. It's here in our last section of the village because it was still being used in the 1920s, but it would be very important even in the early development. Once there was a sawmill in the area, that's really when you would get more houses, more buildings being made, because it was so much easier to get the wood. At the very, very beginning, I showed you the corporate
Oh, looks like Morgan found one of the spots that the internet does not like. Hi, Morgan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You cut out briefly talking about the harness shop, I believe, when you were coming just past the wall towards the harness shop from the annex.
So did you hear anything after the harness shop?
We didn't hear anything about the harness shop on.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm not going to walk back there just in case it's our internet Wi-Fi being a problem. But I was talking about with the harness shop, about these buildings and how...
Oh, sorry, not harness shop, the tinsmith.
Oh. Did you hear me talk about the sawmill?
Yes.
Okay. Did you hear me talk about the Corbett Tavern and how they had a sawmill?
That was about the last thing we heard.
Okay. Well, basically I was saying about the tavern is that the inner part were logs, but the outer part looks the way it does because the family owned a sawmill, and so they were able to add on the clapboard on the outside. I think that's all it said. And then I paused for a moment, so we should be okay. So here at the back of the Denfield General Store, you can see actually kind of the annex extension that comes off of it. The original Denfield General Store did have an extension annex like this. But if you notice, you can see our sign, as Allison mentioned, for the tinsmith shop. The Denfield General Store did not originally have a tinsmith shop, but in 2017, we received some capital funding to rebuild the addition, and we decided to use these spaces to put in a few storefronts. The museum used to have a series of replica storefronts, but they were torn down before I started the museum because they weren't safe anymore. But they have been replica buildings that had housed a few different collections. One of the collections that we are looking to add back into a storefront was our tinsmithing collection. And so Here at the back of the general store on the annex, we've actually put in a tinsmith shop. And the tinsmith is another good example of a business that really had to change with the times. Tinsmithing has been important throughout our entire timeline, all the way back even before the 1800s. Since tinsmiths were portable, they could move around much easier than a blacksmith, and they were making so many daily tools. But by the 1900s, you didn't need all the things the tinsmith made in the same way. So many tinsmiths adapted and changed. This tinsmith, for example, would focus more on building eaves troughs, was one of the main things they did, or stove pipes, pipes for furnaces and things in the house. So it's another example of a business that really had to change with the times. And so we've really come around now through our 100 years of history. There are many, 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 many more stories that we share at the museum. There are so many more things that we talk about. It's really hard to fit into an hour of time. But we just wanted to kind of highlight the spaces we have here at the museum, some of the topics we talk about, and a few of the things that we're working on. So like I said, we're really working on collecting more of the stories to represent all of the community. We have so much more to talk about and so many more things to share, as well as really making sure that what we're presenting is accurate and authentic too. So we have been looking back at some of the stories we tell, doing more research, finding out are there new things that we can share with visitors as well. But hopefully you can join us. And if you join us this summer or in the future, it's the perfect time to really sit, take your time at the museum. It's very easy to spend a whole day here because there's so many things to talk about. So I'm going to flip my camera around here. There we go. And as you can see, the sun is starting to set here too. But I want to thank you all for joining on our little mini tour of 100 years. I'm going to just pop into our toll gate to turn on some lights so you can see me a little bit better. And I'm going to I can answer any questions that have come up, anything that Allison hasn't been able to answer.
So there we have it, folks. Thank you so much, Morgan. Does anybody have any questions for Morgan?
I have one question that I was gonna get Morgan to answer if she unfreezes again. Otherwise, I can answer it for her from Paul. So we'll just see if she freezes. Perfect. Hi, Morgan.
Hi. Did I cut out again?
You froze when you just came into the building. So I have a question from Paul whenever you are ready.
Yep.
And Paul is wondering about if the village is still acquiring older buildings or if we are focusing more on programming at this time.
So definitely a question that we get a lot. We aren't actively out searching for buildings. We have about 30 structures. And so with that, of course, there's a lot of financial responsibility to make sure the structures we have are being kept up to date, being looked after. And so that's one of the reasons that we're not actively searching anything out. We are focusing, like you mentioned in the question, we are definitely focusing more internally on programming, on messaging, on things that we talk about. We do have every once in a while people who might approach us to ask us about buildings, but it really has to do with what it is they're offering, how it might fit into our timeline, as well as just the space to have it here in the museum too. So it's a big complicated thing when someone asks about us taking a building just because of everything involved. But we don't get that many recently wanting to donate them. But at this time, we're not actively seeking anything out. It's more internal program focusing.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Morgan or Allison? I have a question that maybe Morgan can answer. Of the 100 years of history that the village and the museum covers, of the visitors that come to the museum, what do they find the most interesting? Have you found?
Yeah, I'd say with us, so it really depends where people are coming from. On a normal year, we have a lot of international visitors, and not just people from the United States. We have a lot of, for example, European visitors, and people just from other continents too. So when they come and visit, a lot of the things they find most interesting are kind of the similar experiences to places they live in, like their own home country. So for example, like they will sometimes visit and they'll look at the log house and they'll say, well, we have many houses that still look like that where I live. Or we talk about early farming and early tools and technology. And a lot of those things are still being used in recent memory in places they've come from, or practices are still very similar. So they find really interesting connections with that. We have a lot of newcomers who come and visit us, so people who've moved to London from all kinds of places. And when they've moved here, they're really coming to kind of find out more about their community. And a lot of them, depending on why they came to London and where they came from, especially in recent years, we've had a lot of, for example, refugees come and things like that. And the reasons they came to Canada are very similar to the reasons people 200 years ago came, seeking safety, seeking freedom, the ability to practice their beliefs, things like that. So a lot of them like to share their stories with us. But I'd say the things that people are most interested in when they come are either, especially for local people, is either seeing a building and they recognize it when it was in its original location. So a lot of people get very excited when they remember that building from where it used to be. For example, the doctor's house and Denfield General Store, they get really excited about those spots. And then the other part of it is Fanshawe Pioneer Village is a living history museum. So when you come and visit us, we are in costume and we are doing demonstrations. And we're really talking about that daily life. So a lot of people are coming to see how things were done then and then making those comparisons to now. So it's really seeing a lot of our activities are some of the things that they're most excited about.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
That. Well, if there aren't any further questions, oh, Chad?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment for what you referred to sort of as a trial run or a guinea pig thing. I thought that presentation was fantastic. It was very well done and plenty of information, just enough information to make me excited about visiting again at some time. I've been twice, once with my kids on field trips, and then also as myself as in a field trip, 40 years ago. So anyways, excellent presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I was hoping that the tech didn't cut out. And like I said, Allison knows this, I like to talk. So normally I talk much, much longer. But that's something that I'm glad you shared. It's great to hear that you've got that interest in coming and visiting again. Definitely one of the most common things we hear is, I came on a field trip when I was a kid, or the last time I was here was chaperoning a field trip, is one of the most common things. I do a lot of outreach in the community, especially in London at libraries and community groups and sometimes community fairs. And a lot of people will say that they didn't know we existed, or, well, nothing's probably changed there. We change all the time. Like I said, Even as recently as 4 years ago, we had 3 new display buildings set up. So our tinsmith, our harness shop. We also, I didn't mention it, we have on the front of the general store is a very small rotary office as well. So those are new spaces. And just really our interpretation's always changing. We're always going back and looking at some of the displays in the houses and what's accurate. Is there things we can update? And then we haven't been able to the last year because of the pandemic. We also normally have a seasonal exhibit that we have in our community, our office building, which is the Spria Center, has a gallery in it, which is the Trillium Community Gallery. And in that gallery, we actually will have an exhibit with objects from our permanent collection. So the things that don't get to be up in the museum, up in the village very often, some of those older, more delicate objects. And so those gallery exhibits tend to be around themes. We were supposed to have an exhibit last year open that was on tools of the trade. It's really focusing on different trades and different tools connected to London, because we have a lot of things in our collection on that, that we're hoping to kind of digitize the exhibit over the next kind of few months. We can have a digital exhibit because it was completely installed and ready to go the week of shutdown in March a year ago. So we're still hoping to kind of showcase that. So there's always new things to see.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, the tech went really well.
Perfect.
It went really well, I'd say.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation by Morgan Shropshire for the Strathroy and District Historical Society. For more information, please visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Strathroy Historical Society or visit our website at sdhsociety.weebly.com. Thanks for watching.